Last video we left off talking about Stanley Miller's experiments and how life came to be, potentially, in an ocean full of organic materials and lightning and whatnot. This one we're going to kind of go through fairly quickly. You learned evolution and natural selection in biology, but once there was life, however it got here or started here, it began to adapt and change through time. So evolution, if you remember, is the change in allelic frequencies over time. Hardy-Weinberg, everybody's favorite equation. Or not, don't worry, I'm not going to make you do it again. But the general idea is that there are too many organisms born who can survive. There's limited resources. That advantageous traits that allow them to survive and reproduce over their peers are selected. The traits are then passed on, and that the organisms adapt not only to their conditions but also their environments. And this last one I added in here because it becomes really important later on. Not only do organisms adapt to their environments, organisms will actively modify their environments so as to better survive. So this is going to become important later on as we talk about coral reefs and whatnot. So this is a review of some vocabulary. Hopefully you remember what a heterotroph is and an autotroph. Troph meaning feeding, hetero means self-feeding, hetero means different feeding, things that actually eat, basically animal-like organisms. And then autotroph is self-feeding organisms that manufacture food, usually from an external source. Kids get this one wrong all the time. Heterotrophs came first. We always like to think of ourselves as so much more evolved than plants. But animals were here first, some sort of animal, whether it's single-celled or whatnot. And that's because it's easier. It's easier to just eat. And as we expect from Miller's experiments, there was quite a bit of food just floating around in the ocean. So there were these early single-celled organisms, and they could just swim around in that primordial soup and eat up the other organic material that was around. So that was easy. The autotrophs came along later on, and they're actually wildly more complicated than the early heterotrophs. Now, the first autotrophs were probably working by chemosynthesis, and they were probably similar to the anaerobic bacteria. And anaerobic bacteria are things that work without oxygen. Their respiration doesn't require it. If you've ever dug in the mud down at the marsh and smelled that hydrogen sulfide smell, that's anaerobic bacteria. And it's really an important idea to understand that anaerobic bacteria, or something very close to them, came first because there was no oxygen yet in the atmosphere. So the chemosynthesis is the idea that instead of using the sun for the energy source in the first autotrophs, that it may have been chemosynthesis from chemicals within hydrothermal vents. And this is a radical idea. It's relatively new, that instead of evolving at the surface of the ocean, that the origin of life may have actually been at the deep sea floor. We find some very primitive things there, unlike anything else we find at the surface. So chemosynthesis is another word you need to know, and the idea that it's possible that autotrophs didn't actually evolve in that sunlit zone for photosynthesis like we like to imagine, but it may be that they evolved down at the bottom of the seafloor in the absence of light, and importantly, in the absence of large amounts of oxygen. Now, photosynthesis and respiration that we know now require oxygen. So respiration takes in water and carbon dioxide, you take sugar and oxygen, and you split the carbon dioxide, you give off energy, and you produce water. Photosynthesis is literally the exact opposite reaction. If you notice in this little diagram right here, the only real difference is that they've sort of flipped the arrows around. They are equivalent reactions. So photosynthesis takes water and carbon dioxide in the presence of energy and turns it into a chemical form of energy, sugar. Respiration reverses that. Please be aware, all photosynthetic organisms, or all autotrophs, also undergo respiration. It's not like they only do photosynthesis. They do photosynthesis in order to undergo respiration. This becomes really important. Photosynthesis is sort of a unique style of making your own food, much more complicated than chemosynthesis, as I'm sure you learned in bio and maybe forgot. There's photosystem 1 and photosystem 2, and they're some of the most efficient and hard to simulate, energy systems on the planet. So they're very, very effective. This gives rise to something that is frequently called the Great Oxidation Event, this was like sounds all super happy for us because we're like, yay, oxygen. But the first organisms on the planet could not survive in the presence of oxygen. Oxygen is very, very energetic when you do have the ability to utilize it. But when you don't have the ability to utilize it, it actually rips things apart. You may have heard about free radicals. Oxygen is a free radical, and it will literally bond with most organic molecules, especially in the presence of light, and rip them apart. So when oxygen first became prevalent, it was a poison. And that's weird to think about now because, you know, we kind of need it. But about 2.45 billion years ago, oxygen began to increase. There's a couple of reasons why this started. There were a small amount of photosynthetic organisms, like the cyanobacteria. They didn't really account for most of the oxygen. We believe that there was oxygen present in the Earth's crust, silicon dioxide. There was some in the atmosphere, the carbon dioxide, and different chemical reactions freed some of that, and enough of it that it began to dissolve into the oceans and kill off our anaerobes. And the anaerobes that we have still alive today are the, you know, descendants of those that were able to hide in areas where there's very low oxygen, places like mud. That's why the mud can harbor anaerobic bacteria and make that sulfuric acid smell, because there's no oxygen down there. So cyanobacteria were very primitive plants. They're frequently called blue-green algae. And when the oxygen came about, they were able to utilize the oxygen for more advanced cellular respiration. Not only that, they produced even more oxygen, potentially as a competitive way to outcompete other anaerobes. This chart is in your book, but the general idea is it was 2.45 billion years ago that the Great Oxidation event happened. It was mostly over by 1.8 billion years ago, but the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere hasn't been stagnant. It's been going up and down. This dotted line here, right here, that's basically our present oxygen level, about 21%. And you can see that it kind of goes up and down. We've had very low periods of time, and then actually really high periods of time. That one actually confuses a bunch of scientists because 32% oxygen, you would expect there to be way more forest fires, but there's not a lot of evidence of that. And the more photosynthesizers you have, the more CO2 that they take in and the more oxygen they give off. There is a concern that if we lose large amounts of our plant biomass, we're going to, you know, drastically change our atmosphere, which is something that, you know, we do need to be concerned with. And these periods of low oxygen, especially if it's very low oxygen in the ocean, are associated with extinction events. Everybody knows about the KT boundary because that's when all the dinosaurs died off, about in here, right about there. Notice there's a small oxygen dip right there, okay? So there's a small oxygen dip. That's not what killed off everything, but a lot of the plants died off, so the oxygen changed. The biggest extinction event in the history of our planet actually coincided right here with the Permian, when the 98% of all marine species went extinct. And that is believed to be because oxygen levels, for some reason or another, plummeted in the ocean and basically killed everything off. This is a classic diagram of the CO2 oxygen linkage. You know, you have organisms on the surface of the earth that, like these trees, that give off oxygen and take up CO2. They're taking in CO2, giving off oxygen, not just because they love us. As these materials die and make peat, this is supposed to be peat moss or coal, that can get compressed by layers. We even have phytoplankton in here. And all these biological things get locked away, and we get carbon sequestration and oil and gas and all sorts of stuff, which gives rise to the last little bit we're going to do, and then we're done. Radiometric aging. So the age of the Earth. We know the Earth is about 4.6 billion years old. There are no rocks that are exactly this age, though there are ones that are way older than you think. We can do this by a process called radiometric dating. And I know that you talked about this in chemistry, but there's a couple of things you need to know, specifically the idea of half-life. And let's go into this. So the general idea of using half-life, this example is for uranium, that you're starting with, notice we have, at the top here, we have uranium. which degrades into lead through radioactive decay, where it loses, gamma radiation and alpha radiation. If you'd like me to do it on the board, I can. But basically, suppose we started out with 1,000,000 uranium atoms. After its half-life, which is, a little less than 1 billion years, we still have 500,000. Now we also have 500,000 lead. And the same goes through as this decreases, this increases. Notice we never get quite down to zero. The half-life is a diminishing returns kind of thing. As it initially goes down a lot and then goes down smaller and smaller and smaller, sort of like one of these curves if we were to look at a graph. So does it ever actually approach zero? Theoretically, yes. We haven't reached it yet. So because of these very long-lasting isotopes like uranium-235, we can look at the ratios of lead-207 to the amount of uranium-235 in a sample, and using those ratios estimate how old it is. So because we still find some places that's just lead and very little uranium left over, we know that the Earth is approximately 4.8 billion years old. This is really important. And obviously we don't use just uranium. There are other ones. We use this thing called helium halos that are in crystals, which can also use radioactive decay. So you need to just understand radioactive decay and the theory behind it. You've probably heard of everybody's favorite carbon-14 dating. Carbon-14 dating is used to date things that are biological, because carbon is taken up by organic things like animals and plants and becomes part of their tissues, and it decays into carbon-13. And the ratio of one to the other and the half-life can tell us how long that carbon has been locked in that particular source. The geological time scale is big, and we're talking about the different pieces. They break this up, but basically there's eons, which are here, eras, periods, and epochs, if you want to call them. The eons are basically Precambrian, and what we're in now is the Phanerozoic. The Precambrian is basically before there was multicellular life, and everything afterwards is multicellular life. So there you go. So the Precambrian is sort of prehistoric, and everything else is since then. There are terms in here. Everybody seems to know some of these boundaries more than other ones. Right in here, the KT boundary, which is 65-ish million years ago, which would be right in here. And there's a bunch of other time scales you may have heard of. Whoop. Let me go back one. The one that all the fish people know, I hope, is the Devonian. It's the age of fishes, so we all like the Devonian. The Cambrian, when we begin to get like trilobites and stuff. So a lot of these geological timescales are important to know for when different organisms came into about and how that relates to different parts of the Earth's history. Where we are right now would be the Holocene. Basically all of humans have existed in this one little section right here. Everything else was pre-humans. Yeah, we haven't been around very long. I think the general idea is that if you were to look at the history of the Earth as a encyclopedia, the only part that would be occupied by humans would be the last period on the last page of the last volume. We haven't been around very long. So we show you these geological timescales so that we hope you can get a grasp of just how much time there has been compared to how much you and I have personally known. But we're gonna refer back to different geological timescales throughout the course of this class, particularly when we do plate tectonics, and again when we do the organisms at the end. So just make sure you're a little familiar with it. I'm not going to ask you to replicate it. And that is it for this chapter.